I'm delighted to welcome you to this Project Launchpad Leadership Roundtable with our wonderful media. And I can tell you what inspired this was a keen sense. I was asked to write a piece for Education Dive, and as I was crafting that piece and doing research to develop it, I discovered that the mental health impacts on the 18 to 26-year-old age band were 2.5 times greater than they were for any other age group. And that felt so incredibly significant to me. And I began to think of it as the metaphor of the Apollo 13 mission, that we'd sent these young people off on this great adventure, and their launch pad had been deconstructed during that process. Universities had to quickly, and colleges had to quickly respond and think about how to operate differently. Students and their families and supporters had to think about how to operate differently. But what I saw that we needed critically were real-time, low-cost, no-cost strategies that people could implement right away so that we could begin to immediately respond, not simply wait to reflect on it and do research on it for the next several years and say, here's how we could have done things differently. And so we have worked today to really help share strategies so that mid-mission we can have all of leaders across higher ed have the opportunity to hear about real ways that they can make an impact on their students' lives right now. And what we've heard over the course of the day from a variety of sessions is that it's not just about our students. We have to support and help our faculty and staff as well in order to be truly effective in making an impact on our students, because they're often our students' most profound touch point. So thank you so much for being here today. And we're going to kick things off with Lori Mifflin from the Hechinger Report. Lori?
Thank you. Hechinger. My husband says the way to remember it is to say it's the What the Hechinger Report. But it is the Hechinger Report named after Fred Hechinger. Anyway, thank you, President Trump. I appreciate the chance to go first because I'm really eager to hear from the presidents. I feel as if we all know to some degree the magnitude of the problem. We've heard about stress, we've heard about anxiety, we've heard about depression. We know that you've had to scramble to hire more counselors. But we ran an op-ed piece recently by Sean Belock from Barnard College that raised an issue I hadn't thought of, which is that 18 to 26-year-old age group is affected more by uncertainty because they have so little experience in life. The what ifs that are going to happen to them, the what if this all goes wrong, what if the climate falls on my head, whatever, all the different uncertainties that we cope with a little better because we've studied them over the course of decades and we know how things often work out. They don't have that security. So my question, sorry to be so long-winded, is to ask each of you to talk a little bit about what solutions you have found for that particular age group, not just adding more mental health counselors, even though of course that's vital, but are you doing anything else differently to ameliorate that launchpad problem that you talked about?
I'd like to first thank you so much, Lori, for that question and for the pronunciation guide. That's wonderful. And I'd like to invite Joan Gable from the University of Minnesota to respond.
Thank you, Marlene, and thank you for the opportunity to be with all of you today and for the question. So I'm going to push back a little bit, and I'll do it in transparency because I have children in this age group. So I think of this both from my professional role and also personally. And I would say that this age group of 18 to 26-year-olds, they were born in the shadow of 9/11. They entered late elementary school, middle school when the bubble burst, and they're coming of age right now. So while they are young, they have had to already cope with a lot. And what I see in them is a lot of grit and resilience. And that doesn't mean that they don't need help. and that they don't struggle, but they're achieving exceptionally well amidst these struggles. And so it does present a very unique challenge for us as campus administrators to meet their needs, because there is a presumption that if you're struggling with your mental health, that you cannot achieve. In fact, it is a barrier to achievement, but it's a different barrier than we understood it to be. And I think that's why we've had to pivot so profoundly during this period that we find ourselves in. So in addition to counseling, which of course we've ramped up a lot and changed so that it can be accessed 24/7, because surprise, surprise, 18 to 26-year-olds don't work on bankers' hours. And also worked with state boundaries where licensure made some of our students who were staying home have limited access. But without speaking for my colleagues, I'll say that in Minnesota, we've really looked at the wraparound support for students. So what are we doing in the classroom so that the learning experience is robust but not unnecessarily aggravating? What information are we providing outside the classroom about techniques around wellness in addition to counseling services? Are we providing research to the underlying cause, to the tremendous uptick in mental health challenge for this age group? And are we giving our faculty and staff the resources they need so that they can be allies and themselves healthy, because they are the frontline partners to our students. And if they are struggling, as many of us are during this crazy time, then they probably can't be good partners. So I'll stop there and turn it over to my colleagues.
I would add something to that too, which is that we've had to think, when you think about the Launchpad, it's not just, as Joan has said, it's not just the mental health services or the sense of structure. It's also things like a lot of them had internships that were canceled and very abruptly. A lot of them had their career opportunities for events like we have a program called Work You that allows a student to make a working opportunity actually a class opportunity, and has the supervisor work with a faculty member to do assessment. We had to think about how to instantly make those kinds of opportunities remote, electronic. We had to think about how we were going to reconstruct those opportunities so we didn't disadvantage the graduating students. And we actually focused on seniors who were graduating and first-year students who were coming in terms of trying to create. So we were about 50-50 online and remote and face-to-face. We were about half and half. But we focused on our seniors and our freshmen because those were students who were transitioning. We were trying to help with that transition. But there have been a lot of material efforts that have gone into thinking about how do we do these kinds of activities in a different way. Dondi Plowman from Tennessee.
Thank you again for that question and for this group of people here today. I want to push back a little bit on it as well, because one of the things that we can put our frame on what their college experience ought to look like. And I was so inspired this year by those freshmen. I went to the residence halls when they were moving in such a different way than we did. I mean, it was scheduled. There were only a few at a time. They all had on masks. They were so eager to be here. And I taught a course, freshman course. I was so inspired by their courage just to think about coming to school. You don't know anyone. You're going to wear a mask in class. You're going to sit far apart from people. You're going to, and their earnestness and their just real courage, I thought it inspires me. And many of us had Dr. Deborah Birx from the White House Coronavirus Task Force visit our campuses. And after visiting 29 campuses, I was reading an article where she was summing up some of what she observed. And I share her view in some ways that the college students, they adapted their behavior this fall. I mean, it took a while. We had to kind of get pushing there initially. They wore the masks. They stayed apart from one another. They simplified the way their expectations about college. And she said something like, in some ways they're leading the rest of the country. And I really saw that to be true. Yes, it was different, but most of our students were just so grateful to be here. And especially the freshmen, I just admired them. So thank you, Lori, for that question. And I think, this generation gives me hope for the future. Absolutely.
I'd like to invite Maureen McInnes from Stony Brook.
Maury, there's a problem with your sound, with your audio. Maybe try unmuting one more time. No.
We'll come back to you, Maury, as soon as you're able to get the sound figured out. Anyone else who would like to jump in and respond? Okay, thank you. Lauren, do you have another question?
Okay, I think I figured it out. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sometimes the computer switches between microphones and one doesn't work. So sorry about that. I wanted to echo what Donde was saying about the real sort of hope and resiliency that we saw among our college students this year. Really very impressive, the ways they adapted, how much they wanted to be on campus, and how they really owned on our campus a message with each other about, if we all do this, then we can all stay on campus all semester. And they were very supportive of one another, and they really owned our messaging, and that was really great to see. More broadly, on the sort of mental well-being of our college students, what we have learned is it's really about so much more than counseling. It's in many ways about how do we approach supporting them in learning many of the life skills that they will need to be able to access in order to care for their own well-being throughout their lives. And so we have moved to taking more of a public health approach to supporting the well-being of our students. And by that, I mean that we spend a lot of our energy and effort on prevention, on detection, early interventions, and lastly, on counseling. There will never really be enough counseling to meet every student who is having a crisis of the moment related to stress. We, of course, need to be able to treat their very real depression and anxiety. But some of what shows up is that they need to learn ways in which they can support themselves in time of need. And a lot of the prevention work goes to that. Ways in which they learn to support one another. And they learn a lot about that in the prevention work as well. So taking a public health approach, one that is more holistic, and that is working to support our students long before they get to crisis, is a really important step forward in mental health for our students on our campuses.
Thank you so much, Maury. Lori, you had a follow-up question? And then after this, I'll open up the floor to any questions you have. So feel free to send your questions to Lauren.
No, well, Maury McInnes actually just kind of negated my follow-up, because I was still hoping to hear from solutions. I was hoping that you weren't all saying that your students were so courageous and so adaptable that no problems exist that require solutions. I don't think that's what you mean to say, but I was hoping to hear about some of the solutions, and she just mentioned some, the preventive measures and such, but if there are others, I'd love to hear about them.
I'll add a few things to that list. We actually, in much the same way, which I really appreciate that Maury has articulated, we began to think of mental health and physical health as something that needed to be folded into every other kind of process. So we included mental health and physical health, essentially public health in that broad way of thinking, into our strategic planning process. We developed a campus wellness committee that's comprehensive, that reaches across the entire university. It's got folks from academic affairs, from student life, from the counseling center, from the faculty. It's just a full range of folks that are engaged in this dialogue, and they're actually doing problem solving in real time. And we're beginning to think differently about how we engage every process using public health in that mental and physical health strategy. How should we operate differently in student affairs if we think about health and well-being? How should we operate differently in career services? So we're really beginning to thread it in. And we've even done simple things like we've invited our faculty to each put a statement on their syllabi talking about physical and mental health and well-being, and giving students direction to the resources. So even seemingly small gestures like that are helping students access our resources. Joan, did you have something to add?
Sorry.
I'll follow up with just a little specificity since we can provide some. So I want to point out, related to the framework that Maury provided, that getting at prevention is critically important. And so we've focused some attention on that with emergency funds, increased hours at the food pantry, and of course then the counseling and information that we described earlier. One of our improved understandings in this unique time that we find ourselves in is that the mental health challenges that this age group uniquely experiences have some aggravating factors. So we've tried to focus on some of those aggravating factors. We have made additional beyond counseling services available, like health and wellness workshops. We have a program where you pet, a lot of us do pet sweet dogs that we know is a very soothing process. We've provided faculty training at their request so that they both can identify and be an ally when students ask for accommodations, so that the faculty have an understanding of what they're asking for. And we've made resources available to the scholarly side of the house to get at root cause, and also to get at the public health framework that Maury is describing, that we need to understand better and better how to do prevention, how to engage in early detection, how to offer appropriate treatment, because that's a moving target and we should be as good or better than anyone at identifying each of those phases of the target.
We actually had our counseling staff create what was called a reaching out guide, which is available in the Project Launchpad resources. And it actually helped faculty understand, for precisely the reason that Joan is describing, helped faculty understand the ways in which they could not be diagnosticians or mental health care providers, but identify problems and direct students to the right resources, and also give them language, what to say, so they know what to do, because we recognize that they're often going to be the ones who are going to see where the issue is. We have a question from Jesse Mashar at Compass in Knoxville.
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Chancellor Plowman, hello.
Hi, Jesse.
I'm curious about what you all did specifically this fall for freshmen, because I know that every year, obviously, there's in a normal year, a lot of focus on orientation, socialization, helping them to feel comfortable, all with the goal of making sure they come back in the spring and their sophomore year. So how did you approach that? They're your youngest students, college is brand new to them, and they're arriving in the middle of this thing. What did you do?
I'll start with that. We started something this year. We're the Tennessee Volunteers. This is a long story historically about why we're called the Volunteers, but we started this year what we call volunteer success teams, and every single new student, including transfer students, were assigned a 3-person team. It included an academic advisor, an academic success coach, which is someone who doesn't advise you on the content of your major, but it helps you with how to find tutoring. And they all took Clifton strengths. So what are your top 5 strengths, and how do those help you in your major? And then they were assigned a third one, was someone from what we call our one-stop center, which is a combination of registrar, admissions, financial aid. So every one of those new students were contacted, and they began a relationship throughout the semester. And it was a very intentional effort that we probably would have done anyway, but it was exceptionally important during COVID. So that's one thing, one specific strategy that we put in place this year, and we will keep it after COVID.
Jesse, this is Russell at Amarillo College, and I appreciate the question, and I'm going to challenge it and my colleagues just a little bit. So don't hate on me too bad. But I think the question may be misplaced. Our certainly a lot of focus is on the traditional 18-year-old who is just graduating high school and moving into university, and their process was disrupted. But the majority of our students are adult students that have families and jobs and kids at home and hear the term online learning and think they don't have the skill set for it. They aren't comfortable in it, and they're overwhelmed with facilitating their own kids' online learning to manage themselves. And they've been as or more disrupted than that traditional 18-year-old in our traditional universities. And they're equally as resilient, but they're also, I think, even more at risk for stopping out, dropping out, for losing their job that's paying for their education. And they need support in a different way than we were providing before. And that same support, we've learned, has also been needed for that traditional 18-year-old, especially centered on technology. Maybe not technology access. The 18-year-olds have access to it. But we're learning that traditional 18-year-old has the same kind of skill set deficit that the adult student has when it comes to fully engaging technology to learn online. They're wired, they use their phones for everything, but when it comes to leveraging technology and search engines and pulling resources in, they need the same kind of education that our adult students do. And we can't just assume that they may be adept at technology, but they may not have the technology skills for the things that we're actually doing with Blackboard or other platforms. And we've got to give all of our students that kind of technological support, not just our 18-year-olds. I won't have another sermon that I inflict on you like that. Forgive me for it.
May I invite Greta Anderson from Inside Higher Ed to ask her question, please?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for putting this on today. My question has to do with having students in residence halls, and I know that different colleges are managing this differently this year, but I'm curious if you all are finding that having residence halls open and available to students, even if their classes are online or if much of them are online, whether that has a positive impact on their mental health with more opportunities to socialize and build community with their peers. And a subsequent attachment question to that is, have you found that students living at home with family members are experiencing poorer or more different mental health outcomes?
Maureen?
Yes, I'm happy to take this. This is Maureen McInnes at Stony Brook University. And even last March, when we went to remote learning, we left our residence halls open. Because we knew that we had many students, either who could not return home, so we had many international students who remained with us, but we also had many students who at home either were not going to have a place that they could devote to their studies, or they would not have had access to Wi-Fi. And similarly, this fall, we opened our residence halls, and we have many students who joined us even though all of their courses may have been remote. For perspective, about 1/4 of our classes were in person and the remainder were delivered remotely. But we have many students who are on campus, even though all of their courses this fall were remote. And they did so for a number of reasons. I mean, yes, it was access to Wi-Fi, but for most of them, and I've talked with bunches of them, and for most of them, it was about that ability, even though altered, to still have that peer support, to still be able to build those peer networks, to be able to study with friends. They might have to do it wearing a mask and 6 feet apart, but having that peer support, staying up with them late in the library, or their ability to still be involved in a more direct way with their campus organizations and clubs. So yes, being in person was very important to them, even if they had no in-person classes. And so I think that for us has been a really important learning. And we heard again and again from our students how important it was for the campus to remain open. And that in many ways was why they were so enthusiastic in embracing the expectations of the public health measures expected on our campus, and actually why we ultimately had so few cases of COVID on our campus. Actually, a much, much safer place to be than in our surrounding community. We had fewer than 100 total cases in our campus community. And that was really because the students owned their behaviors and encouraged one another to make it possible to remain.
Joan Gable.
I have very little to add to what Maury said, except probably with full agreement to everything she said, being a very similar experience here. But I will add as a context that not only can we serve students better if there's proximity, although we learned a lot about serving them when there was distance very quickly, and I think nationally speaking very well, but we learned a few very interesting lessons in that there has been this sort of aura for many years now that delivering information, class content, campus life, broadly speaking, was about to be disrupted. Once people really understood what distributed learning could do, we would never have on-campus learning again. And if there's one thing we've really learned, it's that, boy, do our students and their families and our community partners want to be on and near campus for when it's possible classroom learning, sure, yes, as a cornerstone, but for campus life broadly, for the professional and research opportunities at the campuses that do that, and also for engaging in the broader community, particularly for those of us who have a lot of town and gown, that being a part of the campus community puts you in a broader conversation, a broader opportunity to express voice, a broader dimensionality to your education. And they can get that online in a certain way, but they can get it in person in the way that they prefer. And so I don't see the demand for that going away, both in the dorms or in the classroom.
Thank you, Joan. Dondi Plowman.
Another point I want to raise that came up earlier in a panel in the earlier conversation today was how much we all learned, I think, about how important the out of classroom life experience is to the learning that happens in the classroom. And as much as we, as a former academic dean and provost, as much as we would like to think that students come to college so they can major in blah, 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 students come to college also to have a roommate and to experience that and to begin to live independently and to join a Greek organization. It's the whole package. And so yes, the dorms, hugely important. We have a requirement that all freshmen have to live in the dorms. This is the only time in history that we've ever lifted that requirement so that we could, space out a little bit more. So we had 7,000 rather than 8,000 students on campus, which gave us a little more flexibility when we needed space when things were spiking. But the RAs in the dorm, for example, they were another very helpful arm of the university to stay in connection with students. Because that, I think, for all of us became such an issue, is the isolation and the need for connection with each other. As human beings, we all need that. And especially when you're 18 to 22 years old. So the dorms played a huge role in that.
Thank you so much, Dondi. Let me invite Mike Melia from the Associated Press to ask his question, please.
Yeah, thank you. This is I'm with AP based in Connecticut. Thanks all for taking the time. And I just wanted to back up and ask sort of a big picture question about what you all are gleaning about how severely mental health is affected on the campuses where you work. What are the best indicators you have for how students are dealing with the stress and the strain, And how does this compare to semesters past?
I'll get us kicked off and say that we've done a number of large-scale campus surveys, and we've had really high response rate for those surveys. And what we saw is that in the spring, the students were really grateful at how well we transitioned, and we began planning for that transition in early February, just in case we had to make one. But how well we transitioned to remote. But as you've heard from the other presidents and chancellors, there was a lot of strong drive to be connected with one another. And as we've heard other folks say, it really has been an incredibly high priority for students to be on campus, and not just for their classes. Many of them who are our top students, straight A students, have said they've found that even though they've lived in an electronic world their whole lives, that they found the learning environment, the electronic learning environment, more challenging, and that it was a huge learning curve for them, and that they're really looking forward to being face-to-face. But many of those same students also asked, I'm teaching a class this semester on leading and learning during COVID, and I taught the class in part to learn from my students, but also to share with them what the structure of the university is. So they got actually a chance to talk with a number of our leaders to understand the complexity of the university. And it struck me very profoundly when one of our students said, I would have given up every single face-to-face class to go to one football game. And it was about that sense of, it's not because they deprioritize the academic experience. That's enormously important to them. It's about that sense of feeling like you're a part of something that's much bigger than you are, and being able to connect with others. So I think that what we've seen from the surveys is that even though students have been satisfied, they're feeling isolated and alone, and they're longing for that human connection, as Maury has already said. And Maury McInnes, maybe you'd like to follow up, please.
Yes, thank you. One of the things that we've seen from survey data comparing previous years to first the spring, immediately after most of us went remote, and then in comparison to this fall, is that what we see is some difference in magnitude, particularly around issues of depression, feelings of isolation, maybe anxiety. But the issues haven't really changed at all. And the magnitude is an increase, but it's probably not as dramatic as we might imagine it would be. It is more a slight uptick than a major uptick. You also see some interesting other things, a reduction in certain behaviors, most especially things like binge drinking, which are happening significantly less. And that one's maybe not too surprising if we think about the change in what is possible with social distancing. And so what we really see is that it is in many ways more of the same. And the challenge for us in many ways has been to think about, so how do we, in a world where many of our students may not be living on campus, they might be remote and far from us, how do we particularly continue to connect them with the many resources our campuses have to support the issues that they are facing? And what we've all learned is there are actually many ways in which doing this remotely, using an online format, whether it is for a large group meeting, whether it is for a group training around particular issues, whether it is connecting peer-to-peer for support, or whether it is connecting students with a counselor, in some ways the technology has actually been a boon to all of that.
If I could just jump in, I'm George Blumenthal. I'm the director of the Berkeley Center for Studies in Higher Education. And I just want to emphasize that the experiences you've heard from a couple of university presidents is not unique. There have been large-scale surveys done during the COVID era, in particularly by a collaboration called the Student Experience at Research University collaboration, which involves about 15 or 20 American universities, where they've done a survey of all of those universities and compared the mental health questions, or answers, I should say, from students to the same kinds of questions that were asked prior to the COVID epidemic. And they have seen very significant changes nationally in terms of the responses of students. The rate of mental health issues has gone up dramatically. And it's important to emphasize that this is a national phenomenon.
One of the things we've seen too is that we created, thank you, George, we created, I should also note that George is the Chancellor Emeritus of UC Santa Cruz, where he served as Chancellor for 13 years. We've created free group therapy sessions, and we've seen just an explosion of use of those sessions. In fact, we ended up having to open them up to faculty and staff as well. So we've seen, and it's partly because people want to be in groups to talk about their problems. They don't want to just have a one-on-one session. They want to be in groups. They want to be connected with each other. Joan Gable? You're still on mute, Joan.
You'd think I'd have that mastered by now. Just adding to what you've heard from my colleagues, last month in Minnesota, we did a summit for all of higher ed across the state with the University of Minnesota, Minnesota State, the tribal colleges, and the Private College Council to really look at our statewide data, and invited in an expert from Healthy Minds, which is a national data aggregator in this space. And they are reporting what George has reported. And it's important to remember the starting point that this age group, whether they're university or college students or not, the 18 to 26-year-old age group that we're largely talking about, although not exclusively, with absolute respect to my colleague from Amarillo, has on average 42 to 43% diagnosed mental health challenge, and that was before the pandemic. And there is an assumption that is starting to bear out anecdotally in survey data that you've heard about, and then we're almost certainly going to see in the formal data collection process an increase in the percentage. I think there are a couple of things that are starting to emerge from this. One is that by virtue of the work that we've undertaken as university administrators, that are health care professionals and partners have undertaken, and the students have advocated for and created for themselves, more uptake in the services that we're providing. They are accessible in ways that they were not before, and we're doing a lot of work around destigmatization. And I think that one of the outcomes of the pandemic is a lot of destigmatization. And the other is that some of the sources of the kind of stress that would put a student in a condition where they would need services, where they might traverse from one level of mental health to a more challenged level of mental health, are aggravated right now. So they are isolated, they have financial challenges, they have fear of illness, they may have family issues, and they have just this aura of uncertainty that we're all coping with right now. And we've pivoted accordingly. So the percentage of students who already had diagnosed mental health challenges was already so high that one would almost refer to it, I mean, you could call it an epidemic, or you could refer to it as a new normal. I mean, when you're at 42% known, you can assume that half of your students, give or take, are dealing with this challenge. That means it's part of life right now. But the circumstances that are worsening, aggravating, are worse, and there is a silver lining of mitigation around destigmatization.
Yeah, and I'd like to add just one more thing, because Joan was doing such a good job of listing many of the stressors, not all of which are COVID related, but are very much of the moment. And we shouldn't, I think, leave off of this list and an opportunity to address that for many of us who have large communities of students of color on our campuses, the last particularly 6 months, which of course has coincided with the pandemic, has seen enormous issues and conversations around racial injustice, real fears among many of our students of colors around racism and the ways in which their communities have been impacted by the events that occurred over the summer. I know Joan is, and her community is very intensely connected with that, given that the killing of George Floyd happened very close to her campus community. And that has been a really significant added stressor to the other impacts that COVID has brought, that are not just about new ways of learning, different ways of communicating with one another, but significant economic insecurity, which for many of our students is very real. Their families losing jobs, they're losing jobs that had helped support them through their education. And for those that are getting ready to graduate, total uncertainty about what future awaits them.
I think also we heard expressed today several times, and Maury, you had a great example. I hope that you would give. We hear from our students about just how important it is to, when you're taking a class in person, you walk into class, you greet people on the way in, you sit next to someone over the course of a semester, you interact, you might even make a friend in class. And when it's all remote, that's so hard to do. Maury, can you offer that suggestion that your students gave you? I thought it was fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, it was just such a smart idea, exactly as Donde was saying. You know, there's class is not just those maybe 50 minutes in a classroom. It's the time walking in, settling in. It's the time afterwards as conversations continue and you walk out into the hallway and across campus together. And so a student suggested, please open Zoom 30 minutes before class begins and leave it open 30 minutes afterwards. You don't have to be there, the student was saying to the faculty member, but rather it allows us to begin to build our own community.
Great.
I'll drop into the chat a link to the article I wrote that gives a lot of the data. I gathered a lot of research globally about student mental health issues. Please feel free, if you have any questions, to Zoom chat them to Lauren Griswold, who's in the group. And let's turn to Kevin Richert from Idaho Ed News, please.
Good afternoon, President Trump, and thank you all for making the time for this. I wanted to ask you all a little bit about how you see mental health services looking on the other side of the pandemic, based on what you've seen these past few months. President Lowry Hart, you were talking about this morning that you feel like you're seeing more students accessing mental health services online, that they're more comfortable in that setting as opposed to maybe a face-to-face setting. In one of the breakout sessions later in the day, Chikora Martin from Mills College was saying, our students aren't accessing mental health services because they're so burned out on Zoom meetings. They don't want to go to another Zoom meeting. And that dichotomy really struck me. And I'm just trying to get a sense of, what do y'all think this is going to look like or should look like on the other side?
I would think that hopefully there'll be a balance. I understand the Zoom overload. We all experience it, but it has proven itself to be an accessible, easy tool to connect. And so what we've seen is, before the pandemic, we would have all of our mental health counselors, and we have 3 that are available all throughout the day. And they would be booked, and about half of them would be no-shows. Now, only 5% of our students who have made appointments, and our counselors have never been as full as they are now seeing students, but there's only 5% of them that are no-shows. So we have the same number of appointments, but we have much higher interaction with and service to our students. And a lot of what we've noticed with our mental health counselors is that it is the pressure of managing to work and have a family and to live in this pandemic. But there are other pressures that we've seen students not have before, with food, with uncertainty about emergency aid, that our counselors are having to connect them to other services beyond just helping them manage the mental health issues that they're walking in with.
A metaphor I'd like to share that I used a lot with my leadership team when we first went remote is that one of the things I live with my 93-year-old mother, and it means, and I'm her sole caregiver, and it means that I have to be very, very attentive to any sort of public health practice. And I started using Instacart when the pandemic hit so that I could order groceries to be delivered to the home. And there were things I liked about it and things I didn't. I wanted to pick my own produce. I wanted to pick my apples. I wanted to pick my kale. You know, I wanted to be able to choose those things, and my strawberries. But there was an incredible convenience that I learned with Instacart that now, in the next year, if I'm traveling somewhere for work, which I often do for work, and my mom calls me and tells me she needs some groceries, I can get them delivered to the house for her, and she doesn't even have to think twice about it. So I've created new strategies for how I will use that technology that I was forced to use for a period. And I think we're going to see the same thing with services and mental health care for our students. So instantaneously, our career services went remote. Our counseling center had already had a telehealth component, but we became much more robust in our use of telehealth, both for physical health and mental health. And I think for a lot of our students and for a lot of our institutions, we've learned ways to be flexible. We developed a program called Bronco Gap Year that we thought was going to be used by those transitioning high school students, but ended up being used by many of our current students who needed the flexibility of having a faculty mentor who was dedicated to them, able to take up to 12 hours of online credit for a single low price, but a dedicated faculty mentor to support you in that effort. And so we had students who were sophomores and juniors who used that Bronco Gap Year, and we thought it would just be high school students transitioning in. So we're going to see ways, I think, that our students and our institutions are going to start to be just much more flexible and adaptable about how they use everything: mental health services, other kinds of support systems. If a student can go to career services with a computer sitting on their lap in their own living room and not have to look for parking and not have to navigate traffic and do it at a time of day when it's convenient for them, they may be more likely to use those services. So we're seeing a lot of changes in the way that students use those things. May I invite Sarah Brown from the Chronicle of Higher Education to ask her question, please?
Hi, everyone. Sarah from the Chronicle. So mental health impacts are often delayed. So many of the effects of the pandemic on students may not be realized right away. So sort of in the same vein of thinking ahead and sort of looking ahead and moving forward, how are you preparing for the possibility that some of the more serious impacts of the loneliness, isolation, and the anxiety this year won't be realized until a few months from now or a year from now? I mean, I imagine even starting in the spring semester, which will take place before the vaccine is widely distributed, the fatigue around social distancing, the loneliness may really start to set in and cause more serious mental health issues for some students. They kind of, maybe they got through the fall, they made it okay, and by the spring hit and they're just exhausted with it all. So can you talk about how you're planning for that, sort of looking ahead to the spring semester and beyond?
Russell, I wonder if you might have something to say about that, and then Maury, I'll come to you.
I think it's real, and we've got to use the time we have now to be prepared for it. Our students need more robust support than they've had from us in the past, and it's going to be more so, Sarah, as we move forward. I think we're going to have to be prepared to hire more mental health counselors. I think the things that we've done at the college that I know my colleagues have too is everyone at the college has gone through mental health first aid training to identify what might appear to be on a surface an academic issue of disinterest, but it might be a mental health trigger that we can then use our early alert systems that now have a mental health component to it to connect students to the resources that we have available, leveraging the relationships they have with faculty. It's leveraging some things that we've done on smaller scales, scaling them and increasing the availability of them as we move forward. But part of it is, I think, going back to Kevin's question and some of the previous questions, is normalizing getting help, normalizing talking about mental health challenges. And the more you can train your staff and faculty to embrace those conversations through their classes, and then the more you're going to connect students to those resources, and the more they're going to use them.
Maury.
Yeah, so Russell covered it very importantly. I think that what many of us are doing at this moment is working really hard with our campus communities to think about how we work now on a lot of those prevention strategies. This is a time for us to really invest heavily in thinking about how do we destigmatize getting treatment, how do we connect our students with the kinds of resources that are going to help care for their well-being at this moment. This is when prevention plays such an important role. How do we get the rest of our community well educated about the issues and the things they should be looking out for so that they can connect people early on, long before we get to crisis. And that's the kind of work at this moment that we need to be doing to try to forestall what is such an important topic that you pointed out, that we're likely to see significant impacts down the road as well.
Thank you so much, Maury. I'd like to invite Cindy Perman from CNBC to ask her question, please.
Hi, thanks you guys. I really appreciate you doing this and allowing us to take some time to ask you questions. So my question is, we're seeing some kind of scary numbers about the number of students who are being forced to drop out for financial reasons. Maybe a parent lost a job, or you see a lot of kids, especially low income kids, that might be working 5 jobs and they lost 3 or more of them. And, things that are just the numbers just don't work out. And so I wondered if you guys could talk a little bit about what you're specifically doing to try to help students financially, so they don't have to drop out, or if they do, to, get them back on track quickly. And then just part 2 of that question, I wondered if you guys are worried. I know there have been talk that maybe some universities might have to raise tuition at some point. Are you concerned that that could actually make more students have to drop out because they, can't afford it?
We had Sarah Goldrick-Robb on campus, who is the author of Paying the Price, about higher education, and especially those first generation and socioeconomically disadvantaged students, and the incredible hardship. What we've seen nationally is about a drop of about 1/3 of the investment in higher ed nationally. And interestingly, that's directly proportional to the increase in tuition. So essentially what's happened nationally is that the cost burden has shifted from states, and there are many states in the country that have some kind of language, like Arizona, for example. I was at Arizona State for a number of years. There's actually language in the state constitution that says that higher education should be as close to free as possible. And of course, the Morrill Act tried to make public higher education accessible to students. And so we're definitely, and I was one of those students who worked 3 to 5 jobs the entire time I was in school, and I was driving down a highway to one of my jobs once, and literally as a first generation student, literally my oil filter fell out of the engine of my car. All the oil drained out of my car, and my car seized on the highway. And I suddenly had to figure out how I was going to get to 3 jobs, because that's what was paying for my education. And I was very, very fortunate that I had a roommate who was willing to let me use her car for the entire rest of the semester until I could save up enough money working extra overtime hours to get my car fixed. But right now, what we're seeing is that a huge proportion of our students are experiencing those kinds of problems. When I was an undergrad, I grew up in the state of Wyoming. When I was an undergrad, it cost $435 a semester for in-state tuition at the University of Wyoming. I still remember it. And now that's just not a possibility for most students to imagine, because as those cost burdens have shifted over to students and their supporters, it's really changed the stakes of what we do. And so there's been an urgent effort on our part to raise money for scholarships, but also to provide and endow those scholarships wherever possible so that we can ensure those resources, but also to help students really access the support networks, not just at the university, but in the community, that will help them begin to be able to keep on their feet so they can keep in school. Because one of the most heart-wrenching things to see is a student who spends 3 years or 3.5 years and doesn't complete, because then they've made a huge investment of their time and their money, and they don't have the credential that could make a difference in their future. Several of the other presidents would like to respond. So may I invite Joan Gable, please?
Thanks, Marlene, and thanks for the question. So with full endorsement for everything that Marlene just said, some of the specifics that are occurring on our campus and that we're hearing about from a lot of our peers, so I don't think that these are unique, is, of course, we distributed the CARES funds, and those made a big difference in one-time support. We've created emergency assistance funds. We already had those, most of us do, but we did a very specific fundraise around them and carried those through into the fall semester. You may recall that most of the CARES money had to be spent in the spring. A lot of us in higher ed administration were very worried about that restriction, and were able to use that as a way to, in effect, treat the CARES money like a challenge gift for some of our philanthropic supporters in order to get them to create additional emergency fund availability for our students. And we've communicated like crazy about the availability of those funds and set up really specific information with our one-stop student services so that if students, so that there can be a proactive outreach if we see a student falling off or falling behind. We've also set up a lot of forgiveness. If you're late on your payment, either for tuition or some of your fees, you're forgiven. You can continue to register. We will work with you. That has been decided and heavily communicated. And then we're also working on things like food pantry and a recognition that for many of our students, their safest place is in student housing or with access to student services, and making sure that they can stay there if that's what they need. It's expensive and it's an interesting challenge, but we're optimistic because we know that the incoming administration has targeted federal programming around making college as free as possible for students whose family income is below a certain level. The number today is 125,000. We'll see where that ultimately ends up. We're working on a similar plan on our campus that would join very well with that. So I think it's really like a wraparound financial support that is the key to making sure that the students can finish the last mile for exactly the reasons that Marlene describes. You want to avoid the tragic outcome of failure to progress at the very last phase.
Maureen McInnes.
Well, Joan just said most everything that I was going to say, so it's just sort of an echo, but I would just like to put in a plug here about what an important role the federal government could play in the continuing support of our students in higher education with additional funding to support those students this year. The financial challenges that our students are facing were not just a challenge of last spring, and that support is desperately needed for this academic year as well.
Thank you, Maureen.
Could just add, could I add one thing? I'm
Sure.
sorry. Everything that's been said is so spot on, and we all are, struggle with this. In Tennessee, we're very fortunate that we have what's called the UT Promise, that any student who qualifies, whose family has an income of less than $50,000 a year, pays no tuition here. But that's one piece of the equation. And what we all experienced in the spring was you send students home, we'll go remote, and all of a sudden we were buying laptops and mailing them to students who didn't have them, purchasing hotspots and mailing them. as we think about what we've learned with virtual learning, there's a conversation going on this fall among faculty about requiring students to turn their cameras on because you're disengaged if you don't have the camera on. Let's think about through all the way. There are oftentimes students who are taking their class from home where there's multi-generations in the room, children. I mean, it's so every single decision we make, Cindy, we really have to be thinking about that, the income disparity that is so large on all of our campuses. And you wouldn't think of that a decision about how you manage your classroom. Actually, you need to think about, you know, how that differentially impacts students. So it's something we've all are working on, every one of the institutions represented here today.
Thank you so much, Dondi. Russell?
Cindy, I think it's a critically important question, and I appreciate you asking it. None of our institutions are capable or should be social service agencies, but the pandemic's going to require us to have systemic, intentional relationships with all of the services in our communities, and we're going to have to leverage them to ensure that our students have the full support that they need. Before the pandemic, according to the HOPE survey that President Trump referenced with Sarah Goldrick-Robb, 48% of my students were food insecure and 54% of my students were housing insecure. I can't imagine how that's grown since the pandemic, but I can tell you from the services in our food pantry and the social service support system, what we call our Advocacy and Resource Center, where we have 3 social workers and social work interns that case manage every one of our students. We have seen over half of our 10,000 students through our social services with needs for fixing cars, needing help paying for childcare, finding childcare, paying rent, paying utilities. We've leveraged CARES Act for a portion of that. But what we've learned is that the need for emergency aid is so far beyond what the CARES Act has provided that we're having to do even more emergency aid than we've ever done before. Every one of our employees, faculty and staff have been trained in language and understanding the mindset of poverty. And the pandemic has required us to act on that in ways that we never fully understood. But case managing our students and connecting with the resources that exist in our community and pulling all of those resources together in some kind of package that keeps students afloat is critical. No social service agency has eradicating poverty in their mission. They have meeting a specific piece of it. We're having to glue those agencies together and the resources they provide to ensure that every barrier that our students face can be met so that they can stay in school, as Marlene referenced.
I want to ask my colleagues, and I'll launch into this if they have any thoughts on this question. A question I've been thinking about a lot lately is, if in this global moment, higher education has had to fundamentally change, not just in its practices, but in its role in the world. And one of the things I think about, and I'd invite my colleagues all to respond to this, one of the things I think about is that we're living in an incredibly polarized world right now. Not just in the US, but across the globe, we're seeing fractures in cultures where there's extremes on both sides, and it's very difficult for those folks to connect and talk with each other, or even to understand one another. And it seems to me increasingly important that higher ed be a part of moderating a meaningful conversation between those very often far apart groups. In fact, I heard a sociological study cited to me that said that historically, the only that groups that were at war, and if you take a nation that's at war, and you interview the folks on both sides, the folks on the two opposing sides do not believe that the people on on the side that opposes theirs could possibly have any good motivations. And that's part of what characterizes such a significant rift, that it is in a war zone. But we're seeing that for the first time in modern American history, that folks on different sides of the political spectrum or different sides of issues just don't believe that people on the other side could have good motives, that there could not possibly be any good motives. And so I really see higher ed with its focus on deep learning, deep analysis, dialogue and communication, and rigorous engagement as a place where those conversations can begin. And I want to invite my colleagues and see if they have any other thoughts about the way that higher ed's role is evolving.
Cyril Connolly, a philosopher, and I can't quote him word for word, but he wrote something that has stuck with me, especially as we're in this tri-crisis of racial justice, pandemic, and economic crisis, that we hate what we fear. So where hate is, fear is lurking. That the undercurrent of the hate that seems to have taken hold in dividing our country, the undercurrent of that hate is this fear of other. And we are the microcosm of what our country can and should be, in the way that we can relate with each other, talk with each other, learn from each other, connect with each other. That's the power of what happens in higher education across sectors, is we learn not just course content and curriculum, but we learn about people that are different from us, from different parts of the world from us, from different lived experiences than us. And before the pandemic, I think we were embracing that call that Marlene just talked about. And I think the pandemic has exposed that we have so much more work to do when things like a pandemic are politicized, when things like masks become a dividing ground for which side you're on. We're going to have to step in and be the glue that glues our country back together, because we know how to facilitate deep conversations and relationship building, and to find commonalities that can rebuild our trust in each other. And I think we're going to have to step into that space intentionally and profoundly.
George, thank you, George.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize that I think Russell was very profound in what higher education can do. And I think Marlene asked an absolutely excellent question. But I want to emphasize that this is going to be challenging for higher education, because we live in a very interesting time. We live in a time in which, to the extent that there's a rift in society, one side of that rift is much more trusting of higher education than the other. And it is incumbent on us to be able to earn the trust of both sides. The second challenge that we face is the challenge of what free speech means. On college campuses across the country, there have been issues about whether or not free speech is the traditional First Amendment type of free speech, or whether it really is an obligation to keep it safe for the audience, that the audience feels safe in hearing speech. Those are two very different concepts, and it's caused a lot of publicity, but I think it is a challenge for higher education. And I think that if higher education in this country can actually meet the challenge, as Russell expressed it, to bring forth both sides, to be an honest broker of ideas, to really be a place where people can share ideas, disagree, and actually debate rationally issues of public policy, then we will have served our role.
Thank you. Cindy Perman from CNBC.
Hi. Thank you for indulging one other question. So I'm delighted to hear that some of you are experiencing a situation where students are following the rules, and that they're just happy to be there and they're wearing their masks and everything, but we've all seen, not necessarily at your universities, but we've seen, videos and photos of college parties and students who kind of break away from their parents to go to school, and then whatever rules they've been told to follow, which, is part of, I think, growing up anyway, finding your independence. But so I guess I'm just wondering, how you guys are working with students to educate them to make sure that doesn't happen, and even policing, because I hate to say that, but to some degree, to make sure that they're doing things so that there isn't a super spreader event or anything on your campuses.
That's such a great question, Cindy. And I'll tell you that one of the things that we did, it was one of the things we invested the most energy in before we came back together in the fall, was asking, how do we, especially in a state like Idaho, where personal freedom is a huge priority culturally, how do we engage our students and really encourage that participation? And because for our student community, our athletics programs are, regardless of what the sport is a huge part of the glue that holds together our community. We actually utilized our student athletes to talk about being a part of a team, and we created a marketing campaign called "We've Got This Covered." And it was so successful on campus. In fact, we have 1/3 of the positivity rates on campus as the surrounding community. It was so effective on campus that local businesses actually asked to be participants in that campaign. And so the local business community engaged it too. And that doesn't mean that there weren't times when students didn't make choices thinking, oh, it'll be fine, or it's just a minute, or just, like any human adult. I mean, Thanksgiving will be an interesting time for us to imagine what happens in the future for our country. It doesn't mean that there weren't sometimes those choices made, but so often they made choices that were in the interest of public health. And it was because of that desire Maury talked about earlier for us to be together. They really were profoundly invested in that. But we found that we actually had to think about it as a marketing campaign. I wonder if my colleagues have any other thoughts they want to share.
I'll speak to that a little bit. I to be honest with you, Cindy, we learned as we went. Going into it, we had all the verbal campaign. Vols are going to help Vols. Students are engaged with us, helping us think it through. Student Government Association was helping. I'll be honest with you, over the semester, I think we used the carrot some days and the stick some days. And early on, when there was our biggest issues were off-campus events where I don't really have any authority, nor do the campus police. But I had the bully pulpit, and I called out some behavior and said, we're going to hold you responsible. Oh, that made students upset. And I don't blame them in a way. We also used the carrot. I mean, I gave out I'd go around campus, all over campus with gift cards. I see somebody with a mask and get a $5 gift card to pastry shop, Starbucks. I mean, we've just, and I think by the end of the semester, things were working. I felt so much better, but it would be insincere of me to say we walked in with a plan, administered it, and everybody just fell in line, because it really wasn't that way. I think we all had to kind of get into it and then see the numbers spike. We had to put in place some restrictions on campus, and we limited any type of gathering. We were able to lift them when the numbers came back down. So it was just this dynamic learning experience as we went. I'm really proud of the students. It wasn't easy for anyone. They didn't like it, and I don't blame them. You don't come to college to not have parties. And so that was hard. But I think we've kind of set the bar now for next semester. I'm hoping we all have a little bit better idea how it's going to go.
I would say our campus community has had a very different experience, relatively low case counts, students who really own the messaging with one another. But I will say, I think a very important piece of that is we were able to put in place regular surveillance testing from the moment that they showed up on our campus. So they were expected to come with a negative PCR test, and then we began PCR testing immediately. And I do think that for students who know they are going to be tested, what was once a week, what will be in the spring, twice a week, that builds in a certain personal accountability around their own behaviors when they can keep in mind the goal of remaining on campus. And I think, it's quite possible there's another factor in the state of New York where Governor Cuomo announced early on in the semester that if any campus had as many as 100 cases in a 14-day period, that the campus would go to all remote for at least a 2-week period. And so from the stick standpoint, I think that was very early on out there among our students as well. And so the combination of the testing and knowing that if there was a spike, that it would go to all remote learning was probably also motivating for them as well. But mostly I'm very proud of them for, from the very beginning, owning the message and working to hold one another accountable.
Joan?
So we had some advantages in Minnesota because our semester starts later than some of the schools in other parts of the country. And so while our students were not perfect when they came back, and we did have a few events in the beginning, our students also had their friends at peer institutions experience alarming surges. And so as Dondi was saying, the information was available to us, but the way in which it would actually come to life as we made our plans was an unknown, and we had to make some of our changes on the fly. I will say though, on the debate and the discussion of surveillance testing, there were a lot of campuses that did very extensive testing and had surges. The availability of testing is an interesting behavioral component, whether it's a carrot or a stick, is something that I think we'll need the benefit of hindsight in order to be able to analyze in the right and fully understand. And I also think there's a campus culture component to it. But I think that a lot of students come to campus. We often talk about the first 6 weeks of the semester as the sort of red zone, to use another football reference back from the beginning of Marlene's remarks, of when students have just left home and often are making some of the choices that concern us the most, and they often taper after that point. We had an accelerated version of that this semester where students came in and did some of the things that students sometimes do, that no matter what you do, carrot or stick, sometimes they do, but then they saw an immediate and alarming consequence of varying levels of severity, and across the country tamped down. So very few of us ultimately had to close. Very few of us had surges that created any risk any worse than the surrounding community where they would have been had they never come at all. And they completed their semester, they've progressed this much closer to their degree, and all the other good things happened, like food pantry, mental health counseling, other types of support, the community engagement, such as it was, the opportunity for learning and research experiences, et cetera.
I want to throw out another question to my colleagues. Thank you all for those contributions. One of the things that I'm really conscious of is how we serve students who are not right in our communities right now, because as people have become more place-bound with the pandemic, but also for other reasons, for economic reasons often, or for family reasons, as people are place-bound, we're asking questions at all of our institutions about how we serve those students. And some of us have extension programs or have offices in other places. What we're doing at Boise State is a program called the Community Impact Program, where we're moving into rural communities and giving some face-to-face component for their classes, and then creating the flexibility for online learning. And what we're finding is that those students that we talked about earlier, who are the completers, what we're finding is that those students are really eager to access those programs where there's some face-to-face component, the flexibility of online, so that you're writing an email to a professor you've actually met instead of someone that you've only ever seen on a screen or in a photograph. And we've seen a great embrace of those programs. And what we hope is that we'll be able to really develop that in the future to help those completers finish. And I wonder if any of my colleagues have any thoughts about what they're doing differently in terms of outreach right now.
I'll jump in since we're the land grant and we are a multi-campus system. We have been working through our extension offices to make sure that our mission, core mission, continues, and it has included mental health support along with financial guidance for people who need to learn or borrow. So a lot of the programs already existed, but we're communicating and promoting and tailoring those programs. We're also working with some of the agricultural cooperatives so that their programs that they've been doing with their farmers, both in terms of mental health support, but also in terms of bridging digital divides, where there's tremendous absence of high fidelity connectivity in rural parts of the country. We're working with them so that extension offices can be depots where they could access Wi-Fi, much like the example that you described earlier, Marlene, and also that if they're offering mental health support and in particular destigmatization information to their cooperative farmers or members of the communities in which those farmers live, that we're a part of that. And because of the kind of state that we are, once you leave the metropolitan area and in large part even within the metropolitan area, in order to really spread the word and spread the resources, you work with the agricultural community, which we do proudly as a land grant institution. I'll add one more thing before anyone else jumps in. This is something that may be more specific to our part of the country than to others, but we have a similar set of challenges with our tribal community partners and the indigenous nations, of which we have 11 in the state of Minnesota, where in some cases, really difficult Wi-Fi access, very strong sense of place, which can make traveling to resources challenging, and a question of destigmatization varies, of course, within different nations, but we've been working very actively, very similar sort of multifaceted approach with extension, ag communities, and indigenous partners.
Thank you so much, Joan. Sarah Weissman has a question.
Hi, thank you all so much for being here and for speaking with us. You know, going back to the mental health piece combined with the events of this summer, I'm curious how you're thinking about not only mental health, but targeted supports for students of color as the pandemic continues.
Colleagues? Thank you, Dondi.
One of the things we have in plan for this coming semester is our student success area is targeting some programs around men of color. That one of the retention areas where we struggle more is in retention being coming back between the freshman and sophomore year is among Black males. And so we're targeting some efforts there, and special programs aimed at helping students succeed and getting tutoring where we need it. I think I was very proud of our student body this year with their response to, and our campus's response to the events of the summer and the really deeper reflection that we've all been involved in and the things we need to change on campus. I think we've been heavily focused this afternoon, it feels like in these comments, largely on COVID. And I appreciated Russell a minute ago reminding us that there's really the three crises, which is the racial injustice, the economic situation, and COVID. And I think all three of those have been part of this entire summer and fall for every university in the country. And maybe my other colleagues have some additional comments about that.
One of the things go ahead, Russell.
At Amarillo College, when we did our data analysis, especially in the use of our social services, our data analytics indicated that our Hispanic men probably needed access to our advocacy and resource center more in the pandemic because of the jobs that they were in. The service-oriented jobs that a lot of our students were in were most at risk, and they were the least likely group to use the resources we had available. And we did phone calls, we did emails, and it didn't work. And so I used secret shoppers to kind of help me figure out how to break the code of what we were miscommunicating. And I was stunned by what we learned. We changed our messaging. I sent a personal letter in the mail that gave it some additional heft and credence. And basically it said, "You're the hope of our community. The future of our economy rests on your ability to stay in school. And we've got all of these resources to make sure that you can stay in school because we know our community needs you." We had students walking into our advocacy and resource center with the letter, like with their kids. It connected in a different way. And it was a powerful lesson for us in that communication. It's not just the conduit or the amount, but the way you frame it and the honor that you bring to the conversation, especially for some of our men of color, has to acknowledge who they are and where they are rather than saying, "You need help, here it is." And we've seen a significant uptick in our Hispanic men using the resources that we put in place for them as a result.
I see that we have exhausted our time, and what I want to do first is thank my colleagues for their willingness to be here and to be a part of this conversation. Thank you so much, colleagues. It's been an amazing day to hear you all and your colleagues from other institutions speak to these critical issues. And I again want to thank our community of journalists. Thank you so sincerely for the work that you're doing right now and for all the effort that you're making to inform and educate and bridge and create understanding. I think it's absolutely critical. I get to meet with a group of student journalists every year, and I tell them in many ways what Russell says to the group of students he reached out to. You're so important for our future. Thank you for doing this critical work. So I thank you, and I thank my colleagues, and it's been wonderful to be in dialogue with you today. Feel free to reach out to any of us via email. And thank you to my team for all your work putting together this event. Have a great afternoon.